Hi, I'm Brent Farley with Farley Law, and today let's talk about some of the recent banking as a service enforcement actions that we've seen issued by banking regulators in the past few months. Now, in the past several months, we've seen quite a large number of enforcement actions pushed out in this area, and so that's brought some attention and concern to banking as a service relationships. And so let's quickly go over a few of the themes that we see in the consent orders and the enforcement actions that have come out. And then maybe let's talk about some of the causes for the enforcement actions and might be what might possibly be done to avoid those sorts of enforcement actions in the future. Because I think it's avoidable. I think banking as a service has a strong place in the financial services industry, and I think if it's properly managed, uh, and done well, that it could be a profitable and valuable relationship for banks and for non-bank financial services providers. So let's go over some of the themes in some of these consent orders. And so most of the time in these consent orders, what we're seeing is criticism on Bank Secrecy Act compliance and anti-money laundering monitoring and compliance. And so you see a pushback in the consent order on what has or hasn't been done in those areas, and also some specific instructions and directions to the board in those particular areas. And I think at least one of the consent orders, we've seen an order where the bank needed to go back and review transactions, for instances where they had missed filing suspicious activity reports. I think that's telling of the types of issues that regulators are seeing in the banking as a service um, space. So another thing that's common in the consent orders that we're seeing is instructions for the board to provide additional oversight over banking as a service activities. And I think to a large extent that's indicative of the bank possibly not paying enough attention to its banking as a service offerings, not providing enough oversight overall, or maybe missing some things that they may not have thought of initially in their oversight program for the banking as a service offerings. And so those are a couple of things, and I think those can be largely corrected. And so some of the underlying activity I think that's causing those enforcement actions to arise are we have some banks who have engaged in a large number of banking as a service offering type of relationships, and so you have this multiplicative effect where you have a bank who's going to go get a financial services provider um, that's going to have a lot of relationships with a lot of different customers. Those customers are going to be brought in and have a direct contractual relationship usually with the bank. And so you have this multiplier effect where you have not just one banking as a service relationship, but you have multiple relationships. And then all of a sudden, the bank needs to be in a position where it can exercise some oversight over dozens or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or even more customer relationships. And the bank may not have put all of the infrastructure and review and oversight in place to manage those levels of customer relationships. So maybe think about it in typical banking terms and say, I want to offer a new deposit product. Well, you're going to make sure that you have deposit ops staff on hand, and that you're going to have a process and procedure for drawing in the deposit accounts, making sure all the documentation is in place, making sure you've identified the customer, making sure you've gone through the beneficial ownership requirements, and so that everything is documented and set in place. And then you have monitoring programs and software and systems where you can look at transactions and monitor for illicit activity. So you think about that. That's already fairly complicated, but let's take that programming and move it one step removed from the bank, and then let's place several hundred or thousand or even more customer relationships under that sort of infrastructure. So it's a different kind of oversight, and it's different from what the bank would be doing directly. And I think that's where some of the lack of transparency is causing concern for regulators. Um, and I think that's where some of the issues may need to be fixed. So yeah, if you take a step back, I think one of the ways that this can be resolved or avoided, one of the things that we talk to our clients about is when you're contracting with a banking as a service type provider or of another very involved service provider, you make sure that you need to try to put the bank in the position of a regulator of sorts with respect to that relationship. So the bank needs to be able to oversee policy and procedure, right? So you need to be able to see and understand and make sure that relationship has correct or usable, feasible policies and procedures, where that fintech group can onboard customer relationships and make sure they're doing the risk management piece, make sure they're doing the onboarding piece correctly, they're getting correct disclosures and agreements and things out to customers. And then on the back end, they have enough infrastructure in place to monitor and oversee transaction activity, to monitor for Bank Secrecy Act type concerns, for fraud, for illicit activity, for anti-money laundering type concerns. And the bank needs to be able to follow the policy and procedure, needs to be aware of changes, needs to be able to monitor and check that those policies and procedures are being followed. And if not, the bank needs to be able to enforce its position in that regard and say, hey, you need to stop this. Hey, you need to start this activity. We need to make these adjustments. The bank needs to have enough staff and oversight that it can actually operationalize and enforce that type of oversight. So I think to a large extent that may be driving some of the enforcement actions. Now, don't want to too much play Monday morning quarterback. I do know that sometimes you enter a relationship and you get down the road a ways and you realize, oh, there are some things that we need to handle. And so maybe there's some of that going on as well. Obviously there are other things in enforcement actions that we could take a look at, but I think that that if the bank will take the position where, we need to sit in a spot where we understand the process and procedure and policy that this organization is implementing and be able to oversee it and monitor it and enforce it, I think that goes a long ways to resolving some of the problems that we're seeing today. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.